Well, good morning, Bendale. It is a joy to be with you in a kind of a strange way this morning and to share the next message in the series that you've been walking through in Luke's Gospel. I wish I could be with you in person. I wish we were able to, see each other and interact, but this is going to have to do for now. I'm excited that you've been studying Luke's Gospel through the summer months and probably long before the summer months too, I think. And I'm excited for Luke chapter 21. This is an interesting chapter that includes a lot of Jesus teaching about how events are going to unfold for his disciples, the first people who heard him teach these things 2,000 years ago, and also for us. And I think there are principles here in Luke chapter 21 and some prophecies about what's still to come that lies in front of us, and so much for us to learn together from this teaching from Jesus. So I find it difficult at the same time to just sort of jump in to one chapter because Luke's Gospel and the life of Jesus unfolds over time and records events that occurred over the period of Jesus' ministry. So I wanted to sort of work our way towards Luke chapter 21 together if we can, and make some comments on other parts of Luke's Gospel and Jesus' teaching and sort of Jesus' whole mentality, I guess. It comes through the way that Jesus was thinking all the way through, really, most of Luke's Gospel. When we get to Luke chapter 9, so many chapters before Luke 21, the passage for today, in Luke chapter 9, verse 51, Luke tells us this: when the days drew near for him, Jesus, to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. And he sent messengers ahead of him who went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make preparations for him, but the people did not receive him because his face was set towards Jerusalem. So we know from Luke's Gospel as early as chapter 9 that Jesus is very aware of his future. He knows how the events of his life will unfold. And he's resolute, he's focused, and all the way through now from Luke chapter 9 onwards were the events, the teachings of Jesus, the events of his life are all kind of in the context of this traveling, this movement to Jerusalem. And it's not just to visit Jerusalem in a general kind of way. It's not just to be in Jerusalem for the Passover. Jesus knows that he's going to Jerusalem to suffer, and he knows that he's going to Jerusalem to die. It's interesting that in verse 51 it says, and I've already read this, when the days drew near for him to be taken up. Luke doesn't say for him to die. Luke doesn't say for him to be lifted up. That's a language that Jesus uses about himself. He says, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness so that people could be saved, and that's a whole long story that I can't go into, but he says, just like the serpent was lifted up, so the Son of Man, so I, Jesus was saying in John's Gospel, must be lifted up. And that's a reference to him being lifted up on the cross. But here in Luke 9, it says, when the days drew near for him to be taken up. That's a reference to his ascension, that he was taken up into heaven after he had been resurrected, after he had been crucified, he ascended into heaven. So Jesus' mentality is not just that he's going to Jerusalem to suffer. He certainly knows that. And that weighs heavily on him. And it's interesting. I think it's a good thing if you haven't kind of had this mindset already, but it's a good thing to read the Gospels and the events of Jesus' life, just knowing that every single day that Jesus got up, he knew where this was headed. and he knew where it was headed for him. But here particularly, Luke tells us he's not just thinking about his suffering. He's not thinking of the cross. He's looking past that, and he's anticipating being taken up. We know very, very clearly that Jesus was aware of what was going to unfold, and there are all kinds of places in the Bible where this is very, very clear. John chapter 10, he says, "The Father loves me because I lay down my life for the sheep, and I lay it down that I can take it back up again." So Jesus is very aware. He says, I'm not laying, no one takes it from me. This is John chapter 10. "No one takes my life from me. I lay it down of my own accord." So Jesus, in the Bible, we see that Jesus knew what he was going to suffer, and that nothing took him by surprise. Just recently, if you were together or heard the sermon from Luke chapter 19, Jesus is super, super clear in Luke chapter 19 about how he's going to suffer. I think, anyway, that's in Luke chapter 19. Oh, maybe it's not. It's always bad when you write down the wrong. Oh, here it is. It's actually in Luke chapter 18. I wrote down the wrong reference in my notes, which are taped to a ladder that also has a phone taped to it, so I can record this for you. But anyhow, that's a whole other story that I didn't need to share, but now I have. So Luke 18 is the chapter, and in verse 31, we get a really clear idea that Jesus absolutely knows what's going to happen to him. He says, verse 31, and taking the 12, he said to them, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and everything that is written about the Son of Man by the prophets will be accomplished. For he will be delivered over to the Gentiles, and will be mocked and shamefully treated and spit upon, and after flogging him, they will kill him, and on the third day he will rise." And Luke goes on to say they didn't understand what he was talking about. But when you just look at those verses, and we can't go into them in detail here, but verse 32 of Luke chapter 18, there is a lot of detail there from Jesus about exactly what is going to happen. So Jesus' whole mentality in all of his ministry, and certainly as the days approach, he makes it even more clear to his disciples. He knows exactly what is going to happen to him. It all brings to mind kind of a hint, I guess, of where I want to head in terms of application. What does it mean for us that Jesus knew he was going to suffer, and not only that he would suffer, but that he would be vindicated, that he would ultimately be victorious? What does that mean for us? Maybe the place where this comes through most clearly in all of the Bible is in Hebrews chapter 12. Verse 1 of Hebrews chapter 12 says this, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses," these are all the people who've had faith in God before us, "let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising its shame, and is seated at the right hand of God." The application for us in general is that Jesus lived his life anticipating two things: suffering and vindication or victory. Jesus knew he was going to suffer. He was prepared to suffer. He was prepared for things to go badly in his life, and go badly in a unique way, in a devastating way, in a terrible way, as he suffered on the cross. And he also was self-conscious of the fact that that was not the end of the story, that he would be vindicated, that victory was coming. In the language of Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, "For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame." And he's a pattern for us. I've just said, and I'll say again, the suffering of Jesus is unique. Only Jesus' suffering is a substitutionary suffering for sinners. Only Jesus' death on the cross accomplishes salvation for us. At the same time, Jesus sets a pattern by his suffering that he very intentionally wants to teach his disciples about. And he wants them to be prepared for their own suffering. Again, going back to Luke's gospel and kind of ramping up to Luke 21, listen to what Jesus says in Luke chapter 12, verse 4. I tell you, my friends, do not fear those who kill the body, and after that have nothing more that they can do. Jesus prepares his disciples, here specifically in Luke chapter 12, verse 4, to suffer even to the point of death. He says, don't be afraid of people who can kill you. He doesn't just tell them that in some sort of, that's not just sort of some general principle. He's preparing them for suffering. Christian tradition teaches us, and we have every, it's reasonable to believe that the tradition of the church, that all of the disciples of Jesus, the apostles, were martyred, apart from Judas. But Jesus isn't just talking to them about suffering in some abstract way. It's very practical. It's very real in their lives that he's preparing them to suffer. It comes through also that he sort of draws a pattern between his own suffering and the suffering that his disciples will go through in Luke chapter 12, verse 50, where he says, I have a baptism to be baptized with, and that's just a metaphorical way of him talking about the cross and his death. And how great is my distress until it is accomplished. Do you think that I have come to bring peace on earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. For from now on, in one house there will be 5 divided, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. They will be divided, father against son, and son against father, mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. Jesus says, I'm going to suffer. There's a baptism coming for me. I'm suffering until it is accomplished. And my life, my message, my kingdom is not going to bring easy times. It's going to bring division. It's going to bring opposition. People are going to be fighting with one another over me and over my ministry, Jesus would say. And so he's pointing to his own suffering, but he's also letting his disciples know things aren't going to go easily for my followers. They're going to live in a divided world. They're going to live with opposition, sometimes from within their very own family. This comes up as well in Luke chapter 14 and in verse 26. Luke 14, verse 26. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. And again, I just want to touch on this without getting into the details of, interpreting what Jesus means by hating the members of his own family. I think there's a clue when he says hating even your own life. Jesus isn't suggesting that we hate our own lives in the sense of being suicidal or not valuing life in this world, but he is saying that these things become so secondary. Even our family relationships are so secondary to the cause of following Jesus. And what's he doing? He's preparing people not to be cantankerous within their own family, not to cause division, but to be prepared for division, to be prepared for criticism, to be prepared for opposition, so that when the moment comes where it's a choice between is it my family or is it Jesus? Is it my life or is it Jesus? He's wanting to strengthen and steel his disciples for a pattern of life in following him that looks like his own life. That is, be prepared to suffer, and beyond that, be prepared for a final and decisive victory that comes after all the suffering, all the turmoil of this life. Jesus speaks about this future hope that his disciples can be confident about. Going back, Luke chapter 12, verse 32, he says, "Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." Something great is coming. He goes on to say, verse 33, Luke chapter 12, this is in the Bible, "Sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide for yourselves money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." Jesus wants his disciples to know not only is he going to suffer, not only are they going to suffer for his name, but there's a victory. Jesus is going to accomplish a victory, and therefore we can, his disciples can anticipate a victory. And he's like, hold the possessions of this life loosely. Let them go. Don't worry about the things of this world. Sell your possessions and give the money to the poor. Why? Because there's a kingdom coming, because there's something better to anticipate, and your life in this world can count for that future kingdom. You can be actually sowing into the future eternal kingdom of God by living the way Jesus would live in this world. Same sort of thing comes up just, I guess, in verse 35 of Luke 12. He says, "Stay dressed for action and keep your lamps burning, and be like men who are waiting for their master to come home from a wedding feast, so that they may open the door to him at once when he comes and knocks," and so on. So he's saying there's something great coming. Stay alert, be ready. So he's not only preparing his disciples for suffering, he's preparing them, for a future and coming kingdom, for a consummation of victory, that there's a great celebration coming. The same kind of teaching comes through in Luke chapter 17, beginning in verse 22. So this is Luke 17, verse 22. He said to his disciples, "The days are coming when you will desire to see one of the days of the Son of Man, and you will not see it. And they will say to you, 'Look there,' or 'Look here.' Do not go out or follow them. For as the lightning flashes and lights up the sky from one side to the other, so will the Son of Man be in his day. But first, he must suffer many things and be rejected by this generation," and so on. So again, he's telling them, the days are going to be coming where you're longing for the appearing of the Son of Man. That's a reference from Jesus to his second coming, when history ends and God sets all things right. And he says, people might even be predicting the coming of the Son of Man, Jesus, his return. He says, don't worry about following people who are making predictions. You're not going to miss it when I come back. He says it's going to be like lightning lights up the sky. My return is going to be decisive. I'm going to set things right so clearly you're not going to have any doubt. But can you see what Jesus is doing here? He knows all through the Gospel of Luke, he knows that he's going to suffer, but he also knows that ultimately he's going to be victorious. And that's in his mentality about his ministry, but he's also teaching and preparing his disciples, one, to suffer. He's normalizing suffering. Don't be afraid of people who can kill the body. Don't expect that life in your family is going to be easy if you stand up for me. You have to resolve that I am more important than even your family relationships or even your own life. You have to take up your own cross. But as he prepares them to suffer, he also prepares them for a final victory. He says you can expect a kingdom that will last forever. Don't hold on to the possessions of this world. Instead, make investments in the eternal kingdom of God. Look forward to the return to my return, like the bridegroom's friends would look forward to him coming to celebrate in a great banquet, and so on. So be prepared for suffering and expect and anticipate joy. This is hard for us because we don't like to suffer, and we want our joy right away. But I think we can say for sure that a Christian mind, if we really allow the Bible and the Holy Spirit and the teaching of God's word to shape the way we think, Paul talks about don't let the world squeeze you into its mold, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So the part of the mold of the world is to hate suffering, to reject it, to look for every opportunity to just numb ourselves and avoid it at all costs. And part of the mold of this world is to want pleasure right now. But Jesus would say to us, no, if you want to renew your mind with the truth of the kingdom of God, you have to be prepared to suffer. You have to anticipate suffering. You have to normalize suffering. That's such a unnatural thing to say, particularly in Canada in 2020, when it seems like, we've figured out a whole lot of ways to avoid suffering, and something like this pandemic that's come along is such a strange thing for us to adjust to, because we're just not used to, in general, in our society, suffering. I know we're all probably quite familiar with suffering in our individual lives, but generally within the culture, there's this message out there: you don't need to suffer. You can just kind of organize and design your life so that your relationships go well, and every weekend is a party, and you just excel in your career, and your retirement is just pure joy. And it's funny because we know that's not true. That's not the life we're living, but we still like the message from our culture that, we should be expecting good things, and we should be expecting that life will go ahead without difficulty. But Jesus would say, no, suffering's part of it. And specifically, suffering as a Christian, suffering because you are following Jesus, is very normal in Jesus' teaching. He's teaching us to expect it. He's teaching certainly his first disciples to expect it. And that kind of confronts us because, there isn't a whole lot of suffering going on in the church in Canada right now. There's lots of suffering in the church globally, but in Canada, that's not something we're accustomed to, and not something that we're willing very often to accept when it comes up in small ways. But Jesus says it's normal. And then he also tells us you got to be willing to defer, to wait for the joy that's coming. Don't be distracted and look for secondary joys that might satisfy you in the moment now. And I'm going to talk more about that at the end. But those are the two big messages that I think kind of set us up for Luke chapter 21. And you might think, boy, that took a long time to get to the chapter. I don't think, you're right, it did. But I think we can get through the chapter and some thoughts on it without taking too much more time. The chapter, Luke 21, begins with this widow who drops a coin into the offering box in the temple. And Jesus makes this famous comment about this. They're in the temple in Jerusalem, so now they've arrived in Jerusalem. As you know from Luke chapter 20, the heat is rising in terms of opposition from the religious leaders, and things are not, you can anticipate things are not going to go well for Jesus. But they're in the temple, and this widow comes in, drops in her coin, and Jesus says this: truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them, for they all contributed out of their abundance, everybody who came and brought an offering. But she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on. And there's a lot we could say about this, but I just want to note, what is this widow a model of for us? First of all, we know she's suffering. She's a widow in the first century, and she's poor. She's poor because she's a widow, likely, but this is a person who's suffering, and this is a person who's trusting in God in the midst of her suffering. So why? I think it's because she's anticipating that God will vindicate her. There's a bigger picture, and she can expect good things from God in the future. And so she gives with a fullness of faith, because she's expecting and anticipating that God is ultimately on her side, and that her story will end well. Maybe I could say more about that, but it's just sort of interesting that this little narrative is in the beginning of Luke chapter 21, and it includes this woman who seems to have caught the message that Jesus has been trying to teach his disciples all the way along. She isn't actually suffering because of faithfulness to Jesus. We don't even know that she's a follower of Jesus. But at this point in her life, she knows a couple things. Suffering is normal. She's not angry at God because of suffering. She's accepted it, and she's enduring through it. And she's showing trust in God in the midst of suffering, which I think points to this idea that she's expecting God to intervene on her behalf. She's expecting her story to end well in the end. But then Jesus goes on from this, and this is where he begins to teach about a number of things. And beginning in verse 5, Jesus first of all teaches that the temple is going to be destroyed. He says in verse 6, as for these things, the adornments and the beauty of the temple, he says, as for these things that you see, the days will come when there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. And they say to him, Teacher, when will these things be? And what will be the sign that these things are about to take place? It's interesting, though. Jesus, first of all, teaches his disciples in Luke 21, see all this that looks so permanent, see all this that looks so secure and that draws so much praise and a sense of security for Israel and for the Jews, this temple. He says, it's going to be destroyed. And we know in history this happened in AD 70, the destruction of the temple and the sacking of Jerusalem. But Jesus says, these things that seem so permanent, they're going to be taken away. And it's interesting to me, he's speaking about a religious site of great significance. And he's teaching his disciples, this isn't the stuff that lasts. I think there's such an application for us now at a moment when gathering in person in church buildings at least is quite complicated, and many churches have chosen in these circumstances not to regather yet. In certain other cases I'm familiar with, it's not possible to gather even now because churches are tenants of other churches or tenants in schools and that sort of thing, and so they haven't been able to regather. It's a very challenging 6 months for us, and we're probably all aware of voices that would really clamor for a return to normalcy. Sort of give us our churches back and give us our freedom to gather again. And there's a lot of comments that could be made about that, and certainly gathering in person in worship is a good thing. It's something that certainly is in obedience to God's word. And I look forward to the days, not just when we can gather with all the technicalities of social or physical distancing and wearing masks and all that, but when we can just get back to normal. I long for that. But it's interesting, can you imagine being a Jew in the first century and Jesus saying, even this temple, and there's such a history of the temple and God filling the first temple of Solomon with his presence and just a place of so much significance for the Jewish people and wholesome significance, righteous significance. Jesus had passion for the temple, right? He cleared out the money changers and the merchants in the temple courts, and he had zeal for the temple, but he says it's not going to last. And so forms of how we worship in history come and go. And I think we have to be humble enough to say, is it possible that what's happening now and the way in which there's shifting and testing and pressure on the church during this time can actually be a useful tool in God's purposes to move the church forward and actually advance his purposes, rather than just having us stuck or retreating, and rather than fighting for the past and saying, give us back the things that are familiar. Perhaps we want to discern, well, it's clear that in the past, God's plan has included the end of certain forms of worship for his people. And there's no entitlement for us to have buildings or gather as we have in the past. And I have every expectation that churches that have owned buildings so far will probably continue to own them, and that we'll return to things being as normal. But I hope you can capture what I'm trying to say, that this sort of instinctive reaction, that the things that seem secure and permanent to us from our limited perspective are not necessarily the things that God wants to hold on to and keep. And so we want to be wise to not necessarily jump to defend or perpetuate things. But this would have been shocking in Luke 21, where Jesus says even the temple is going to be destroyed. And this question in Luke 21 verse 7, where the disciples say, teacher, when will these things be, is an important one, because Jesus is going on to talk about a couple things. He's talking about both when the temple is going to be destroyed, he's predicting those things, and he's also talking about some of the ultimate things. So he's talking about suffering that's coming in the near term, and he's talking about an ultimate time when, again, as he's spoken about already in Luke's gospel, the Son of Man will return and history will end, and God will set all things right. So he goes on from predicting that the temple will be destroyed, and he warns them not to be led astray. That's in verse 8. He tells them don't be terrified in Luke 9. So in verse 9 of Luke 21, he says don't be terrified. So there's both predictions and there's advice. So things that seem permanent, things that seem secure, no, they're not. But don't be terrified and don't be led astray. Instead, remain focused on me, I think is what he would say. He tells them, these things must take place. There's going to be instability, but then the end will come. So he's preparing them to not be panicked when things go strange and when things fall apart, because that's part of the plan. Again, it goes back to Jesus' own understanding of his own work. It was all going to go very dark. It was going to go into suffering that we can't even imagine, but there was vindication coming at the end. He tells them about persecution and wars that are going to come. So as he's told them about persecution within families and those kinds of things, people who can kill the body, he's already been talking about this, but beginning in verse 10 of Luke 21, he says, nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There'll be earthquakes in various places, famines and pestilences. There will be terrors and great signs from heaven. But before all this, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors for my name's sake. This will be your opportunity to bear witness. Settle it therefore in your minds, not to meditate beforehand how you will answer. For I will give you a mouth and wisdom, which none of your adversaries will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be delivered up even by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and some of you will be put to death. You will be hated by all for my name's sake. but not a hair of your head will perish, but your endurance, by your endurance, you will gain your lives. So a lot could be said about this, but first of all, he says there's going to be a time of great turmoil coming. There's going to be wars. There's going to be things happening in nature, earthquakes, famines, pestilences, and so on, terrors and great signs from heaven. So I think that's talking about the time just before his return. But then he says, but before all this, they will lay hands on you. And he sort of speaks directly to his first disciples. And again, he gets into this suffering is going to be coming in your lives. And he talks about them being arrested. He says some of them will even die. Interestingly, after saying that some will die, that's in verse 16, they will put you to death. He says in verse 18, not a hair on your head will perish. And I think that's kind of like when Jesus is talking in John chapter 11 to Mary and Martha after the death of Lazarus, and he says, even though he dies, yet shall he live. That's sort of, I think, the sense that I get there, that even death is not death for Jesus followers. And but he certainly tells them there will be a time of suffering. Interestingly, his advice in light of this suffering that's coming is that his disciples should see it as an opportunity to bear witness to him and not worry about what they're going to say, but he'll give them the words and they'll be able to bear witness in their time of suffering. What an interesting sort of piece of advice from Jesus. This is exactly what he did when he was suffering. He, on a few occasions during that time, he said very little, but what he did say pointed to a kingdom that was not of this world. He bore witness to himself and confirmed the accusations against him, that he was the Son of God, and that his Father's kingdom was not of this world, and so on. So he also teaches his disciples, when you suffer, see it as an opportunity to bear witness, not to complain, not to fret, not to try to wriggle out from under it, but instead stand up, expect me to give you words to say, and be ready to testify. And again, just sort of a parallel to our experience, I along with you, I'm disappointed, probably, I'm assuming along with you, that, sometimes when the church suffers, as we perhaps feel we have been doing in the last number of months, there's this temptation, and we often seem to fall for the temptation to start complaining about our suffering and start talking about our rights and entitlements, and I've heard a lot about the overreach of the government and that kind of thing, sometimes directly in conversation, sometimes just admittedly on social media and from people that I don't particularly know well. But even so, it's discouraging for me that the voice of the church during this pandemic includes a pretty strong voice out into the culture that's like, we're suffering too much and we should have things back to the way they used to be, rather than taking it as an opportunity to find ways to point to our hope and our confidence and our comfort and our security in Christ, which is what he told his disciples to do when they suffered, and he was telling them they're going to suffer a whole lot more than we've suffered so far here in Canada. He goes on in verse 20 of Luke 21 to talk about Jerusalem being destroyed. Verse 20, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart, and let those who are out in the country, and let not those who are out in the country enter it, for these are days of vengeance to fulfill all that is written. And he goes on to say, verse 24, They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. That last phrase at the end of verse 24, the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Jesus is talking about really an inconceivable thing to the minds of, I'm sure, his disciples. They had hoped that Jesus would come and sort of accomplish a military victory and a political victory for Israel. And he's saying, no, that's not what's going to happen. Jerusalem's going to be sacked. It's going to be destroyed. Israel's going to be judged and punished. And there's going to be great suffering for the Jewish people, Jesus predicts. But then he makes this reference, until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And that's really sort of really prophetic kind of phrase, the idea that, there's a big plan of God, and the Gentiles are going to kind of go through their times, and God's going to be working dominantly among the non-Jewish people. And the Bible talks quite a bit about that. But the advice I think that we can take from that is that advice that, keep in mind the big plan of God. So he tells them, first of all, that things that seem secure, like the temple, aren't, but don't panic, and be vigilant, and keep your eyes on me. You're going to suffer, he tells his disciples. You're going to suffer for being my followers. Take it as an opportunity to bear witness to me, to point people to me, rather than as a time to complain or anything else. The suffering is, God's plan is different from what you expected, in the sense of, I haven't come to vindicate Israel as a political nation or the Jewish people. There's something bigger. There's times of the Gentiles ahead, but God has a big plan, and trust in his big plan, I'm sure is what Jesus would want his disciples to do, and what he would want us to do. And again, the principle lands pretty clearly for us in our lives right now. God's not surprised by the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And there's a whole lot of hand-wringing about all kinds of things in the world. And certainly we know what it's like to live with wars and rumors of wars and natural disasters happening. In fact, there have been many times in history since the time of Jesus when people have looked out at the world and said, this must be the end. Everything seems to be falling apart. And we're in a time right now where it's not hard at all to imagine that history is winding down, and that could very well be the case. And Jesus wants us not to be rattled by that, not to be despairing in these circumstances, but instead to bear witness to him and to trust in the plan of God. And then in verse 25, he says, we can expect the returning of the Son of Man. There will be signs in the sun and moon and stars, and on earth distress of nations and perplexity because of the roaring of the sea and the waves, people fainting with fear and with foreboding of what is coming on the world. For the powers of the heavens will be shaken, and they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now when these things begin to take place, straighten up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Jesus wants us to know that when things are getting bleakest, when things are seen most out of control, that those circumstances are exactly the circumstances when Jesus will return, when the Son of Man will return. And so Christians, when everybody is fainting with fear, when everybody is distressed, we don't want to be caught up into those feelings. He says, straighten up, raise your heads, for your redemption is near. He gives us this totally counterintuitive way of looking at life's circumstances, and when things go completely out of control, that we can expect that as things are darkest, that's the moment when Jesus will, in fact, return. Sometimes people have used these kinds of prophetic words from Jesus to have no concern about the world's problems and just say, well, this is the way it's supposed to go. Everything's supposed to go badly, and then Jesus is going to come back. I just want to make a point that Jesus is speaking here, as you read it, signs in the sun and moon and stars, on the earth, distress, and so on, natural things happening in the world that are distressing to people. He's talking about things going completely out of control. And similarly, when he talks about nations warring against nations, those are things that very, very few people have any influence over whether two nations go to war with each other. For those of us who are just regular people, our instructions are very clear when it comes to those things which we can control. And we're meant to be an influence of love and compassion and kindness and caring in the world. There's just nothing in the Bible that permits Christians to be disinterested in the world's problems because we see them as some evidence that Jesus is soon going to return. The truth is, in history, there have been many dark times, and the dark times that Jesus is speaking about specifically that will come just before his return have not yet occurred. And yet there have been world wars. There's been a nuclear Cold War. There have been times of great famine, and there have been nations that have gone through tremendous injustices and sufferings, and yet Jesus has not yet returned. And so our ongoing assignment is, yes, to anticipate Jesus' return, and if we live in those days when things get darkest, as Jesus describes they will, that we straighten up and that we look for our redemption to come. But we also, in the everyday sufferings and of the world where we have opportunity to show compassion and kindness, our instructions are clear. And that's how we're supposed to live, to love God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. I want to just skip now to these last pieces of advice that come at the end of Luke 21, verse 34. Watch yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and cares of this life, and that day of Jesus' return will come upon you suddenly like a trap. For it will come upon all who dwell on the face of the whole earth. But stay awake at all times, praying that you may have strength to escape all the things that are going to take place, and to stand before the Son of Man. This is the advice I want to leave you with. Watch yourselves. And watch yourselves, as Jesus teaches us here, against three things: that you would be weighed down with dissipation. That's a word that no one uses anymore. It's the only replacement I can think of is debauchery, which is also not a word that many people use very much. But dissipation, debauchery, drunkenness, or the cares of this life. Jesus is saying, as history unfolds, as suffering comes into the world, as things seem out of control, there's this temptation to just veer off into a sort of numbness, to just, enjoy yourself. It's later than you think. We're here for a good time, not a long time. These kinds of sentiments that we hear in the popular culture, and those are two references to songs that are probably way too old to be relevant in this sermon. But that concept of let's just have a party, that would be the dissipation and drunkenness. The world's going terribly, everything's going wrong. Let's just be selfish and indulge ourselves. And that's a real temptation. And the church needs to confront the respectable ways. Not many people who would call themselves Christians will overtly just sort of dive into what Jesus would call dissipation or debauchery or drunkenness. Those things will happen, and Christians are capable of every kind of sin, but there are respectable ways that we just sort of tune out into social media or entertainment, or just sort of fantasizing about our next vacation or whatever it is. Jesus would say, don't do that. Don't just check out of this world. Stay alert. Um, and he says, pray for two things: strength that you will escape, the ESV says in verse 36, strength to escape all these things that are going to take place. And I don't think he means escape like, you're not going to be, sort of affected by the suffering. It's not that kind of an escape. I think it means that, escape the temptation to fall, that you'll endure through suffering, and not be trapped by it, and not fall into sin as a result of it. And then he says, strength, pray for strength to stand before the Son of Man, that you'll be standing on the day of victory, that you'll endure through the suffering with a clear view of what's to come, that Jesus will return, that Jesus will set all things right, that he will be lifted up and exalted, that every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. So as we go through difficulties in this world, let's not veer off into just numbing ourselves or entertaining ourselves to death. No, be alert. As Jesus said, as I read earlier, stand up straight, look up, because redemption's coming. And whether it comes, in 50 years so that most of us will experience it, or whether it comes afterwards, that doesn't matter. In the end, Jesus will establish his kingdom completely and forever. I've really taken comfort in a number of circumstances recently, that in my life personally, and as I look out in other people's lives, things that aren't the way I want them to be, things that are difficult, my own sort of personal sufferings, not sufferings because I'm a Christian in the sense of persecution or those kinds of things, but just the difficulties of this world. I found myself saying often about all kinds of things that I wish were better and different: this ends perfectly well. This ends perfectly well. There is nothing in this life, no kind of suffering, no kind of difficulty, that ultimately has the last word, because Jesus rose from the dead, and Jesus, as he anticipated being lifted up, and as he saw the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame. He took the sin of the whole world upon himself, and he was victorious, and he has set all things right for us in the future. And so our stories, your story, whatever we're going through, it all ends well because of Jesus and in Jesus. So be encouraged. I look forward to being with you in person someday soon. God bless you, and have a wonderful Sunday.